We're learning Seder Birchas Hanenim, the blessings that a person should make on bread. That's the place where we're standing right now, by the end of the second chapter. We are in Law 13 of the text we're learning by the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, and he's explaining about different types of dough. Soft dough, nut dough, this dough, that dough. And he's explaining the process of making it, like cooking it, whether it's baked, it's cooked, it's fried. That is going to determine what kind of thing this is. Do we call it bread or not? I mean, halachically speaking, in Torah law, do we call it bread or not? Regardless of what the people call it, we don't care. Is this Torah bread or not? If it's bread, so you have to make a certain amount of blessings before eating, after eating, and so on. If it's not bread, it's different blessings. That's what we're learning. Law number 13. All of that we spoke before. Before he was talking about frying and cooking. Frying means with oil. You can say with more oil, less oil. And cooking means with water. That basically takes this mixture, this dough, out of the Torah, out of the laws of bread. It's not called bread anymore. So you have to make a specific blessing, which is called mezonos, that God creates all kinds of sustenance things for sustenance. And then the blessing that Jews say after mezonos, noahide should not say it, because it doesn't make any sense, as we learned before. But they can say it boy in the Pashas Rabbois, that God creates all kinds of souls and their needs and so on. So all of these that we learned before, this applies to a dough that was cooked before being baked. So you have, again, flour, water, and the person cooked it. That's not a bread. That's not called bread. Cooking is not a process of making bread. However, if you have baked bread that was cooked in a pan, this cooking does not take it out of the Torah, of the laws of bread, complete bread, absolute bread, so to speak, regarding the blessing. So you have to make the blessing that corresponds to bread, hamoitzi, that God brings out bread from the earth, and then the blessings after the bread, and so on, as we learned before. Unless, so again, you have baked bread and you decided to cook it. That's still bread. Unless this bread completely dissolves in the cooking process. That means baked bread, then you cooked it, and it became all dissolved, to the point that you don't have pieces that have a kezais. Kezais is like 28 grams. Because any piece of this bread that still has these kezais, this like an olive, that's what kezais means actually, 28 grams, is still called bread when you're talking about the blessing. Even if it doesn't have the shape of bread at all, because you cooked it a lot, so it's really not completely dissolved, but it's pretty much with a lot of liquid inside of it, so it doesn't look like bread, but still has the size, and it was baked before, so now it did not lose the law of being bread. However, if the pieces do not have the size of 28 grams, then absolutely lost the law of bread. It's not called bread. Even if it looks like bread. So the main thing is the size, not what it looks like. If it has the size of 28 grams, and I know that size and grams are two different measurements, I know that, but it has the size that would weigh 28 grams, that's what it means. Okay, so if it has the 28 grams, the kezais, then even if it doesn't look like bread, it's still bread. But if it does not have the size of 28 grams, this particular amount, even if it does look like bread, but it doesn't have the required amount, is not called looking like bread. and you make a bracha of mezonos. The blessing is that God creates all kinds of sustenance. Even if you fix yourself to eat this, it's called a seuda, like a fixed meal. On many pieces of this bread that was dissolved in the cooking, if there's no kezais, no 28 grams to the pieces that you ate, forget it. That's not called bread. Even if you spent the whole meal eating this and your belly is like exploding of this, yeah, but this is not called bread. Okay, that's opinion number one. And there are those who say, yesh oimrim, there are those who say that even if it did not completely dissolve, but before cooking this, you actually dissolved it with your hands, so to speak, or with a knife, or whatever, the bread into small pieces. So you have a piece of bread. It was cooked, like real bread, absolute bread. And you decided to just destroy it on top of a soup. And you started doing this with your hand, and you completely destroyed the bread on top of the soup. And the pieces that you threw, for instance, into the soup do not have 28 grams. And Alter Rebbe says, like the custom is to do with matzah in Pesach. Actually, our custom is not to do that. We do not mix matzah with anything. But whatever, some people used to do that. Even if they look like bread, it doesn't mean that this toyar is really bread. No. And even if these pieces came back into this in the soup and they got together, they glued together, so to speak, through the cooking, and they became a big piece that at least has 28 grams, even in that case, it's still not called bread. So we do see that the second opinion says that there is a situation in which even with size, it's not called bread. The first opinion says if you have the size of 28 grams, it's called bread. If you don't have the size, it's not called bread. The second opinion says, wait a second, even if it has size, it's still not called bread. Why? Because it got dissolved, not by the soup itself, but you yourself dissolved it into the soup. And even if it got together, and even if for you it looks like bread, I don't care, that's not bread. That's the second opinion. Even with size, because it's dissolved, it's not called bread. So what do? The Alter Rebbe answers, explains a general rule. We explained this before. Safek brachos lakel. Anytime you have a doubt which bracha to make, which blessing to make, then you have to be lenient, permissible, and make the blessing the less blessing you can. For instance, in this case, the difference would be if it's called bread, then you have to make a moitzi, that God takes out bread of the earth, and then the 4 blessings of Birkas Hamazon, the blessing after the bread, and so on. Or the other option is mezonos, that God creates all kinds of sustenance, and then a very simple bracha, boyer nefashes rabos, that God creates everything for non-Jews. So since, again, you have to be lenient, so you make the smallest, so to speak, quote unquote, blessing. However, a person careful with his soul, Baal Nefesh, would be strict with himself and would not eat a lot of this. Because there are opinions that say that this is bread. So if you eat a lot, then you have to make the quote unquote bigger blessing, longer blessing, and so on. If this thing do have the shape of bread. So you have to be careful with this. First, you would say a moitzi, if you want to eat a lot of this thing that looks like bread. Then, first of all, make a moitzi, make the blessing, God takes bread out of the earth, on a real bread, real piece of bread. And, however, this is all about cooking. If you're talking about frying, you have to be strict. You have to be strict in all the cases. That means whether it looks like bread, doesn't look like bread, has size, doesn't have size. If it was real bread and then you fried it, it's still called bread. Still called bread. You have to be careful with that. That's how the Alter Rebbe rules over here. Law number 14. All of these is a very interesting law that really the concepts over here touch not just the laws of blessings, but really other worlds in the Jewish law. It's an interesting thing. There's something called, I think we spoke about this, I don't remember right now, but there's something called din. Din means a law. That's the regular translation, a din. But there are groups of dinim, groups of laws. So sometimes within the groups of laws, it was like a theory of groups. So you have a group of these numbers, the group of these things, group of apples, group of Jews, group of these, okay, many kinds of groups. Sometimes the same element you can find in different groups. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So for instance, if you have natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, okay, it's a group of natural numbers. But if you have rational numbers, like 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, and so on, the number 1 goes in the rational numbers and in the natural numbers. It's a number that goes in both groups. Okay, so over here, same thing happens. Sometimes you have groups of laws in Judaism that some of their laws are common to different groups. Okay, this is what we're going to find over here. All that we spoke before about cooking bread, that's when you cook bread in Hebrew, kli rishon. What does that mean? The first vessel. I'll explain in a second what this means. First vessel. However, if you cook on the second vessel, I'll explain in a second what this is, that's not called cooking. That's not called cooking. Second vessel. Therefore, if you put into a second vessel, which I'll explain in a second, pieces of bread, even if they are smaller than 28 grams, you still have to make a moitzi. They did not lose the quality, so to speak, of bread, of being bread. Okay, what's a first vessel and what's a second vessel? The first vessel is, for instance, a pot that you cook something on the fire in this pot. The pot, when you, for instance, take it out of the fire to serve the food or whatever, that's called the first vessel because it was on the fire. So the walls of the vessel are hot, and that means that they keep cooking even outside the fire, even when the pot is not on the fire. Of course, for a certain amount of time, then it really becomes cold. But for a certain amount of time, it continues cooking. Which amount of time? As long as the contents of the pot and the walls of the pot and so on are at least 42 degrees centigrade. That's what it means cooking in Judaism. That's the definition of cooking, taking something to that temperature. It depends also on the thing, because if you want to cook a piece of metal, 40 degrees is nothing. So you have to really take it to a higher temperature. But for food, liquids, basically, 40 degrees, 42 degrees centigrade, that means cooking. That's what it's called cooking. So, again, the first vessel is the vessel that was on the fire. The second vessel is the vessel to which you pour the food that was on the first vessel. And even if the food is hot, since the walls of the vessel are not hot, because this vessel was not on the fire, suppose a thing that you put on the table. So you pour the food from the first vessel into the second vessel, and then you serve it in the table, in a nicer vessel, so to speak. This nicer vessel is called the second vessel. The definition, again, of a second vessel is it was not on the fire, so it does not cook. Even if the food inside of it is still hot, hot means 40 degrees, it's still hot, but since the walls of the vessel are cold, because it was not on the fire, it's going to get cold too quick, and therefore it does not cook what is inside of it. That's the definition. It's much more complex than when I made it, for lots of Shabbos, basically, because in Shabbos it's forbidden to cook. You have to be careful what you put in the first vessel, in the second vessel, and so on. That's the main place where these laws are really spoken about, but the Alter Rebbe brings it over here. That's what I mean, a din of first vessel, second vessel, is usually spoken about in Shabbos, in the laws of Shabbos. But then we took it out of there and we put it into this group of laws of blessings and bread being cooked. Really? Cooked? Which vessel? The first one or the second one? That's why the Alter Rebbe brings it over here. So again, if you cook all the things that we spoke before, they apply to the first vessel, which cooks. But in the second vessel, there's no cooking, and therefore, if you put bread in a liquid in the second vessel, so the liquid was hot, and you pour the bread inside of it, and then we start arguing. Oh, the pieces of the bread got dissolved or not? What size they have? Wait a second. This is the second vessel. Second vessel does not cook. So that's not called cooking. It's still bread. That's what they're saying. All the time that you did not leave this bread so long into the liquid, whatever, that the bread completely dissolved. If you really leave the bread in a liquid, even if you don't cook it, at some point it's going to be dissolved. Because it absorbs so much water, it becomes like a soup, doesn't become a bread inside. And then it lost completely the shape of a bread, of a baked bread. So you only have to make a moitzi, as he mentioned before, if it still looks like bread. So see the difference between the law 13 and law 14. In law 13, the shape of the bread is not so important, just the size. Why? Because you're cooking, really cooking. In law number 14, the size of the bread is not so important. The shape is important. Why? Because you're not cooking. You just left the bread inside of a soup, a cold soup. You left the bread over there. And it became like, I don't know, something like a white soup, something like that. It's not really bread. It doesn't look like bread. So if it did not lose the shape of bread, it's still called bread. If it lost the shape of bread, it's not called bread anymore, regardless of the size. Now, he goes into another detail in this group of laws of cooking. What happens when you pour liquid from a first vessel? All that we said before about the first vessel cooking is because the walls of the vessel are hot. But when you pour something from that vessel, the pouring itself has no walls. It's just liquid being poured out of a pot, for instance. Does that cook or not? That's the question. Does it cook or not? So this is called in Hebrew iru mikli rishon, a pouring from the first vessel. There's a doubt over here whether we take it as the first vessel itself or as the second vessel. Therefore, don't eat pieces of bread smaller than 28 grams in your plate when you actually poured soup, for instance, from the first vessel into your bread. So, for instance, you have a plate in front of you, and you have a piece of bread in your plate, and somebody brought soup, hot soup, to the table, and you say, "Oh, very nice. I want to pour some soup into my bread." And you start with a pot or with a spoon. It doesn't really matter with what. The spoon already is a whole different law. Could be a second, third vessel. It's really complicated, but whatever. Suppose you pour from the pot into your bread, and the bread receives this liquid and starts like bread being all with liquid. Is that called bread or not? That Rebbe says, wait a second, you're getting into trouble. You're getting into trouble. There's a whole doubt whether this is cooked bread or not. Don't do this. Don't eat it. If you do it, don't eat it. As long as the pieces of bread that you have in your plate are smaller than 28 grams. You can only do this within the context of a meal. So you already made the blessing a moitzi, so whatever you eat now, you don't have to make a blessing, so eat whatever you want. As long as these pieces of bread have the shape of bread. So then you connected both ideas of the size and the shape. If, again, they don't have the size of a kazais of 28 grams, and they do have the shape of bread, so it's a problem. It's a problem when you pour soup from the first vessel into this bread you have in your plate. However, if the shape of bread left from these pieces of bread you had because they dissolved so much into the soup that you were pouring on top of it, or you have pieces of bread that are smaller than 28 grams that were into water or liquid, even cold liquid, too long, and they actually dissolved a little bit, he says. They dissolved to the point that you don't see bread anymore, and they just look like pieces of dough, don't even look like bread. Then you make boile mina mezainos on this. Forget it. If it doesn't look like bread and it's already dissolved, even if it was baked before, forget it. It's not really called bread. Even if you're going to fix yourself into eating this in a meal context, like this is your meal, it doesn't look like bread, forget it, it's too dissolved. All the time that the water becomes like whitish water, that means the bread already dissolved and it doesn't look like bread. Same thing happens with pieces of bread that were into the oven. He's talking about like crackers, something like that. Like bread, soft bread, you put it into the oven, it becomes harder. And people put butter on top of it or something else, whatever. If you take this and you put it into beer, even cold beer, people used to do this. I don't know. I never saw this, but whatever. Suppose people do it. So you put this into your beer, again, even cold beer, or pieces of bread that you can see, the pieces of bread, even if they are small, like as if it was flour, that they don't look like bread to the regular eye. Even so, since it was originally bread and it doesn't lose completely the shape of bread, it's still called amoitzi. So again, you're talking about a hard piece of bread that you know this is bread and it looks like bread, and you put it into the beer or you put it into water. It's a very small piece, but it really looks like bread. Forget it. This is bread. It's amoitzi. You have to make the blessing that God takes the bread from the earth.